1. Which Azure service would you use to securely manage application secrets such as API keys? A. Azure App Service. B. Azure Key Vault. C. Azure Blob Storage. D. Azure Monitor. 2. When deploying an Azure function, which hosting plan provides dynamic scaling and charges only for execution time? A. Premium Plan. B. App Service Plan. C. Consumption Plan. D. Dedicated Plan. 3. Which tool is best suited for automating Azure resource deployments using declarative templates? A. Azure CLI. B. ARM templates. C. Azure Monitor. D. Azure Advisor. 4. You need to enable distributed tracing across multiple microservices in Azure. Which service should you configure? A. Azure Log Analytics. E. Application Insights. C. Azure DevOps. D. Azure Advisor. 5. Which Azure service allows developers to build, train, and deploy machine learning models? A. Azure Cognitive Services. E. Azure Synapse Analytics. C. D. Azure AI Search. 6. What is the primary benefit of using Azure API Management? A. Provides database scaling. B. Monitor CPU utilization. C. Secures, publishes, and analyzes APIs. D. Deploys serverless apps. 7. When designing a Cosmos DB solution, which consistency level guarantees the lowest latency but eventual consistency? A. Strong. B. Session. C. D. Eventual. 8. Which Azure service provides event-driven serverless workflows that connect multiple services together? A. Azure Functions. B. Azure Logic Apps. C. Azure Kubernetes Service. D. Azure App Service. 9. In Azure DevOps, which feature manages version control for source code? A. Boards. B. Pipelines. C. Repos. D. Artifacts. 10. Which authentication method is recommended for securing communication between Azure services? A. Username and password. B. Managed identities. C. API keys stored in code. D. Shared access signature in plain text. 11. Which type of Azure storage is optimized for storing structured, non-relational data? A. Blob storage. B. Queue storage. C. Table storage. D. File storage. 12. You need to monitor performance counters and custom metrics from your application. Which service should you use? A. Azure Advisor. B. Azure Monitor. C. Azure Backup. D. Azure Bastion. 13. Which database offering is best suited for scalable, globally distributed applications? A. Azure SQL Database. B. Azure MySQL Database. C. Azure Cosmos DB. D. Azure Data Lake. 14. When securing a web application against DDoS attacks, which Azure service should you implement? A. Azure Front Door. B. Azure CDN. C. Azure Firewall. D. DDoS Protection. 15. Which deployment strategy reduces downtime by deploying a new version alongside the old version? A. Blue-green deployment. B. Rolling update. C. Canary deployment. D. In-place upgrade. 16. What is the role of Azure Event Grid? A. Processes large data sets. B. Publishes and subscribes to event notifications. C. Manages relational databases. D. Provides network load balancing. 17. Which option ensures code runs only when triggered by an HTTP request in Azure? A. Web jobs. B. Azure Functions with HTTP trigger. C. Azure Logic Apps. D. Azure Kubernetes Service. 18. Which service allows developers to run containerized applications without managing VMs? A. Azure App Service. E. Azure Kubernetes Service. C. Azure Container Instances. D. Azure Virtual Machines. 19. What is the default replication type for Azure storage accounts to ensure high availability within a region? A. GRS. B. Rogers. C. LRS. D. ZRS. 20. Which Azure service enables continuous integration and continuous deployment pipelines? A. Azure Repos. E. Azure Pipelines. C. Azure Boards. D. Azure Artifacts. 21. When would you use Azure Service Bus instead of Azure Queue Storage? A. For simple task queues. D. When ordered message delivery is required. C. For storing binary files. D. For short-lived messaging needs. 22. Which programming model is supported by Azure Durable Functions? A. Stateless execution. B. Actor and orchestration patterns. C. Batch jobs only. D. Parallel threads without state. 23. Which Azure CLI command is used to create a new resource group? A. AZ create group. B. AZ group new. C. Group create. D. AZ new group. 24. What does Azure App Configuration provide? A. Centralized storage of application settings. B. SQL database management. C. Logging and monitoring. D. API protection. 25. Which Azure service supports Git-based versioning for infrastructure as code? A. Azure DevOps repos. B. Azure Monitor. C. Azure Key Vault. D. Azure Bastion. 26. Which feature of Azure Kubernetes Service simplifies scaling pods based on demand? A. Virtual machine scale sets. B. Horizontal pod autoscaler. C. Load balancer rules. D. Availability sets. 27. What is the main use of Azure Cognitive Services? A. To manage virtual networks. B. To add AI features like vision, speech, and language. C. To deploy containers. D. To configure CI/CD pipelines. 28. Which security feature encrypts Azure SQL Database at rest? A. Azure Defender. B. Always encrypted. C. Transparent data encryption. D. Firewall rules. 29. In Azure DevOps, which tool manages and stores build outputs? A. Boards. B. Repos. C. Artifacts. D. Pipelines. 30. Which Azure function trigger would you use to process new files uploaded to blob storage? A. HTTP trigger. B. Event grid trigger. C. Blob trigger. D. Queue trigger. 31. Which API format is fully supported in Azure API Management? A. SOAP only. B. REST and GraphQL. C. OData only. D. REST, SOAP, and GraphQL. 32. Which Azure service helps you test and improve application reliability by injecting controlled failures? A. Azure Monitor. B. Azure Chaos Studio. C. Azure Test Plans. D. Azure Advisor. 33. Which of the following is a NoSQL database service offered by Azure? A. Azure SQL Managed Instance. B. Azure Cosmos DB. C. Azure Database for PostgreSQL. D. Azure Synapse. 34. What is the role of Azure Application Gateway? A. Manages firewall rules. E. Provides load balancing with Web Application Firewall. C. Stores unstructured data. D. Creates serverless functions. 35. Which service allows hosting static web apps directly from a GitHub repository? Azure Static Web Apps. B. Azure Front Door. C. Azure App Service. D. Azure Logic Apps. 36. Which tool would you use to debug live applications in production? A. Application Insight Snapshot Debugger. E. Azure Monitor Logs. C. Visual Studio Code Local Debug. D. Azure Bastion. 37. Which service supports streaming real-time data for analytics? A. Azure Event Hubs. B. Azure Data Lake. C. Azure Synapse. D. Azure Storage Queue.